Good evening, and welcome back to the Pastor Study. There is in the 5th chapter of the book of John a very interesting story that I'd like to read to you. Beginning with verse 1, we read this. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by the five covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the water when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." And then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." And at once the man was cured, and he picked up his mat, and he walked. The story behind that is that an angel would come down from time to time and stir the water, and the first person in the water would get healed. Now, to give you a little cultural background, the Jews at this time, or Jerusalem, Israel at this time, was ruled by the Romans, but prior to that it had been ruled by the Greeks. And the Greeks had a god by the name of Asclepius. He was a son of Apollos, and he was the god of healing. Now, a cult grew up around that, as often does, and they would build temples to Asclepius around or near hot springs, healing springs, and we do that today, not with the temples, but places like hot springs here in Arkansas, where people would go to soak in the mineral spring, pardon me, and it would bring some relief to the aches and pains and the illnesses they dealt with. Other places around the world have something similar. The Greeks would build temples near these springs. People would go and bathe and rest in the springs, and then they would sleep in these temples in an inner sanctum where they would be visited or would have dreams, they would hope, by the spirits, the helpers, if you will, of Asclepius. Interestingly enough, they always came or were always pictured as being serpents. That should give us a clue. And if people were healed, or if people were helped by these hot springs, by these mineral springs, they gave the glory, if you will, or they applied that back to Asclepius and claimed that he was the god of healing. So as Jesus walks up to the pool of Bethesda, remember, they're still in a Greco-Roman world. The mindset is still there. And Jesus is about to do something pretty spectacular. He walks in, sees a man who's been there for 38 long years and has been in pain all of that time. And Jesus reaches down and heals him. Now, several things are taking place here. First of all, he's telling the world that this Asclepius is no longer the god of healing, that there's a new sheriff in town, if you will, and that genuine healing only comes at the hands of Jesus. But there's something else taking place here as well. Jesus is going to the very dredges of society, those that nobody else wanted, those who were sick and lame and in some cases paralyzed. Now, think about the logistics. If you're paralyzed, you can't get up to go to the bathroom. So these people are laying here all day long until someone, perhaps in their family, comes and picks them up on a mat or somehow gets them back home that night and then brings them back the next day. Some of them are no doubt laying in their very own filth because they have no way to get up and go someplace else. I would imagine anybody that was anybody in Jerusalem walked around this pool. They would go blocks out of their way to miss it. And yet here comes Jesus walking right through the middle. Because Jesus' mantra was this: I've come to set the prisoners free, set the captives free, heal the sick, and so on, give sight to the blind. Jesus went because he said it is the sick that need the physician, not the well. So he went to where people needed him. He's just come in John chapter 4 from his encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well, a woman who's been married 5 times. And is now living with man number 6 outside of marriage. That wouldn't play very well in today's church, would it? And that's where Jesus went. Later we find him in the Gadarenes, ministering to a man who was so demonically possessed. They wrap him in chains every day, and he breaks those chains, and those can't even hold him, and he sets him free. What does that tell us? Well, first of all, from my perspective, it tells us that we need to be where the sick people are. And I don't mean just the paralyzed, and as this man was. People who are sick in their souls, people who are sick in their emotions, people who need Jesus. And sadly enough, those are often the people we want to avoid most of all. I was fortunate to have an example early in my life. My grandfather accepted Christ when I was 15 or 16. He was in his mid-60s. He won't go into the details, but he hadn't probably been in a church in decades unless it was for the wedding or a funeral of a very, very good friend. He accepted Christ and got filled with God's Spirit. And all of a sudden, he was going where nobody else would go. God totally changed that man. He went to the hospitals and began going room to room and ministering and sharing Christ and praying with whoever would allow him to. And then he did something else. There was a local state prison, maximum security prison, and somehow my grandfather talked his way into that prison. I don't know how, whether he knew the chaplain or somebody connected them, but to my knowledge, at least at that time, my grandfather was the only non-ordained man they'd ever let into that prison as a chaplain. We're talking mid-1970s, early 1970s. AIDS is just making its appearance, and we knew nothing about it. It was a scary, scary disease, more so than today. There was even the thought, if somebody breathed on you, you could get AIDS. And he went into the AIDS wards to minister Jesus to them. He took Christmas Day and went down death row with presents, obviously approved by the prison, but with presents for each man on death row to share Jesus with them. This is a man who had not been in church in decades. Jesus changed him. The message that tells me, that gives me the example I grew up with that, and the message that I think we get from John chapter 5, and we carried over from John chapter 4, is that we need to be where the sick, the lame, the hurting, maybe the mentally ill are. Because within us, we carry the answer. We're told to lay hands on the sick and pray. Anoint them with oil even. And they will be healed. Now, does that mean everybody gets healed? My experience is no. But enough do for me to know that we serve a healing God, Jehovah Rapha, the God who heals. We're to go to the people who are broken and need somebody to heal them and put them back together. We need to go to those who have no hope and bring them hope. That's the call that's been given to us, because that's the example Jesus gives us. The pool of Bethesda, a man who's been there 38 years, that finally got his healing, not at the hands of Asclepius, I think that's how you pronounce it, but the hands of Jehovah Rapha, the God who heals. And I'll leave you with that thought and look forward to seeing you next week back in the Pastor Study.